So the question regarding should athletes incorporate fish oil supplementation within their dietary strategies to increase muscle mass is a very interesting question, and one that I believe a lot of practitioners are incorporating into their practice. In terms of the efficacy of this, in terms of the dosing of fish oil in this context, unfortunately we don't know that much about the optimal dose of omega-3s or fish oil derived omega-3s. The current studies typically err on the side of caution in terms of giving 5 grams per day of fish oil derived omega-3s, which tend to be EPA rich given the apparent role of EPA in terms of switching on protein synthesis. However, from a practical perspective, I'm not necessarily advocating that 5 grams is the recommendation in terms of fish oil supplementation to increase muscle protein synthesis and therefore muscle mass. We don't know whether lower doses would have that same interactive effect alongside protein. We also don't know about the pattern of the characteristics of the dosing regime that would be most optimal. So for example, do we need a supplementation regime a little bit like creatine, whereby you've got a loading phase and then a top-up phase, or is it best to just give smaller amounts in a regular pattern? So there's a lot to learn about the dosing. We also need to consider, when we think about the dosing, other factors that omega-3s may have an impact on. So for example, wound healing or such like. So for example, in the context of rugby, whereby a lot of contact, likelihood of cuts, then would we be recommending 5 grams per day? Probably not, given that we know that can actually impede the healing response to a cut or an impact.